Thank you very much. Can you hear me? The mic's on? Great. Thank you, Caroline, for that very gracious introduction. I'm going to start with giving you a little bit of background of how this study evolved and how it came about. It's taken us quite a while to complete it. We started in 2004 when economists in the World Bank and elsewhere started talking about the needs to look at growth and to see why growth isn't reducing poverty everywhere, that the impact of growth is uneven and unequal in terms of poverty reduction, and what are the underlying dynamics. When does it lead to poverty reduction and when does it not? And I was, until last year, in the poverty reduction group in the Poverty Reduction and Economic Management Network of the World Bank. So given my background and interests, we raised a very simple question, which is, will we learn something useful if we address this issue from the bottom up? And I was very surprised at the great interest expressed by the chair of our department and the vice president of economic management. And in fact, they wouldn't let me off the hook. So we finally got started on this in 2004 and did a pilot in 4 countries, and out of that evolved methodology. We didn't start with theory. We didn't start with strong hypotheses. So we've broken a lot of rules in doing this research, but we worked with world-renowned economists, political scientists, sociologists, and anthropologists, as well as practitioners, to try and come up with a method that seemed credible. I think one of the best pieces of advice we got in one of these workshops that we did with economists was, don't try and force a marriage between the 2 disciplines. It's going to end up in divorce. So we didn't. We took that advice very seriously. And I won't go into the details of the methodology. It's in the book, but hopefully give you a flavor of what we did. So we started with broad questions, and there were 3 broad questions. First is, how and why do people move out of poverty? Why is it in one community or in one village or in one slum or one area of a slum, one household moves out of poverty and another household close by remains stuck in poverty? Or why is it some households are moving up while others are falling down into poverty? So we're trying to understand the why and how in the process questions. The second broad question that we asked is, what's the role, or how does local democracy interact with or affect people's attempts to get out of poverty? And it was very interesting because as we started talking to political economists, political scientists, their first reaction was, why do you think there's a relationship? Why are you imagining a relationship? I think the debate has moved since, but so I'll be getting into some of the findings on the interactions with local level institutions, political as well as economic. The third broad question is, what's the role of social dimensions, social networks, social stratification, people's social identity, and their attempts to move out of poverty? So these were the 3 broad questions. And as with Voices of the Poor, we wanted to try and see as much as it's possible for outsiders to try and get into poor people's heads, hearts, as much as that's possible for any outsider. Everywhere we use local research institutions, local teams who spoke the local language. While we standardized the tools to some extent, which was a comparative study, each team modified the tools that they saw felt best. We tried to get panel data. We have some panel studies, but in the end, these were limited. Most of our data is retrospective recall. We developed a methodology to measure poverty, and I'll go into that in just a minute. We do have some panel studies. It became a large study. There were 22 countries, 22 studies we did in 15 countries, over 60,000 people using 10 data collection techniques. I'm going to draw a lot on focus group discussions. We did these separately with men and women and youth, and life stories, but we also have quantitative data. But we first used very inductive methods to look at the qualitative data, started looking at the themes that emerged very gradually over 6 months, started aggregating that. And once we felt we had a sense of what was coming out, then we developed the conceptual framework and then applied that to the analysis of the quantitative data. I think the second distinction to draw in the study is that unlike household surveys, which may have 15 to 20 households per community, we have between 100 and 150 households per community. And so we're really able to look at community level effects. And I think that's another dimension that's missing from household surveys, or the way we look at poverty currently, is we look at it at households and not at the community level, and not in terms of local level institutions. We had the distinction within the bank of being turned down twice by our research committee, because, as I said, we challenged and broke a lot of the traditional rules that define good research. I'll let you decide. It's not a perfect study by any means. We made lots of mistakes. We had lots of difficulties, but the study is what it is. And again, we'll let you decide whether it fits your standards of what good research should be like. Let me start with the conceptual framework. This was driven very much by what we found. We basically, if you imagine individuals or poor people, we did make assumptions that they had agency, they had aspirations, they take initiative to try and move out of poverty. Most studies, at least within the bank, look at material well-being. You look at income expenditure, you may look at assets, you look at sort of the economic aspects of poverty. We thought right from the beginning that it's important to look at non-material aspects, and power and rights is very, very critical. I think there would be no poverty if there were no power differentials, and if these power differentials could be overcome in some way. So starting with that, we said, all right, what are the blocks that emerge from the qualitative analysis? And again, looking at the focus at the local level, we divided it into two, that it's the political and the economic. In the economic, obviously in both the economic as well as the political, national policies matter. But since our focus was on the local level, we looked at how the national, we make assumptions about how the national affects the local. So in the economic, we look at the local economy as well as fairness, notions of fairness. And in the political, we look at local politics, particularly local democracy, local government, and political fairness. But in all the countries, we found that individuals don't just act as households, as individuals, they also act as collectives. We found lots and lots of collective action, both in terms of trying to access economic resources, and I'll talk a little bit later about the limitations, but we also saw collective action, which sometimes aggregated into political movements and looking at civic engagement and interaction with local political bodies. But everywhere, and this will be no surprise to you, societies are not homogeneous. There are social differences. In the social markers are different in different societies. It may be caste in India, it may be tribe or ethnicity in another area. So basically, this was the conceptual framework that we used to guide writing, eventual writing, as well as particularly the quantitative analysis. Let me start with the culture of poverty. The first thing we did, one of the reasons why we did the study as we did, is that we thought it's very important to try and put our assumptions aside as far as possible and really learn from what emerges from the fieldwork. We feel it's really important to, and Alison has already mentioned this, really look at the assumptions underlying poverty, and that we don't do this enough, because our assumptions about poverty and why poor people are poor if we think poverty is poor people's fault, it is a rationale for inaction. If we think poverty is poor people's fault, we won't do anything, or we may give small amounts, or we may indulge in charity, but we won't give poor people large amounts of money, and even if we do, we won't trust them to make the right decision. So the tendency is then to over-program when we give money or programs to poor people. One of the notions that is very pervasive and tenacious is the term culture of poverty, which was developed by an anthropologist, social anthropologist, Oscar Lewis, from his work in Mexico. And basically he said that there are 70 traits that hang together, but the term has been misused to basically lead to the conclusion that poverty is poor people's fault. That poor people are trapped in poverty because of their culture, which means that and this culture includes that poor people are drunk, people are prostitutes, people have no work ethic, they have no future orientation, they have no motivation, they are swirling in hopelessness and despair. So we thought it was important to look at this, and we basically find that this is not true. One of the reasons why it's really important to look at this is because of the assumption underlying free markets. The most important and the fatal assumption in underlying free markets is that they're free and that everyone has equal access to opportunity. That's just not true. So if you assume that markets are free and then everyone has equal access and then people don't take advantage of free markets, then you come back to the same conclusion that poverty then is poor people's fault. In our study, we find no evidence of culture of poverty. Whether it was in poor communities in Malawi or in conflict-affected areas, people basically work hard. In Colombia, people said things like, if I fall 5,000 times, I get up 5,000 times. We went to Afghanistan, and in every community in Afghanistan, people said the most important reason for moving out of poverty, or the first reason, most important reason, is hard work. In Malawi, man we met, Wilward, said something like, the problem is the amount of money I get. Inside, I'm not confined. I think big. In Bangladesh, we talked to poor women, and Aisha, a woman that we have as an opening story, basically said, my secret is unity, courage, and hard work. But the reason I'm belaboring this point is then if you look from this to systems, especially financial systems, the evidence has been in for the last 10, 15 years that microcredit works in the sense that poor people repay loans. The rates of repayment go up from 90 to 99%. Yet the financial systems that are still in place don't serve poor people. Why is that? There are very few instruments that banks that help poor people. There are very few instruments for equity loans, and there are very few corporations of poor people even today. So basically, we conclude that even during this time of financial crisis, and by the way, the evidence from the last financial crisis, particularly in Indonesia, is that it was the poor people who kept repaying the loans during the crisis, and it was the rich who were getting bailed out. So I think there's a challenge now is to make sure that the crisis instruments and the stimulus packages as we go forward are inclusive and include poor people. So our basic conclusion from the culture of poverty discussion is that the institutions have to change, our mindsets have to change. Let me show you a couple of numbers. This is a pie chart on moving out of poverty, and we find that about 77% of the reasons have to do with initiative, their own initiative. If poor people were lazy, initiative would not come up as so high, right? And even amongst the chronic poor, we find initiative is very high, but there are other obstacles that come in the way of those initiatives helping them move out of poverty. Also, please note that NGO assistance is relatively low, and illegal activities, lottery luck, is again very, very low. So those are not really the explanations that poor people give us in terms of their their understandings for moving out of poverty. If you look at the opposite, which is falling into poverty, there are two takeaway messages. One is gambling, alcohol, or other bad behaviors not responsible for moving out of for falling into poverty. Rather, it's at the local level, economic prosperity at the local level that really makes a difference. And health shocks are a big part of the story. Illnesses everywhere lead to destitution because poor people have few savings. Aspirations, again, you can see these numbers across countries. Poverty of aspirations is not an issue. Poor people have aspirations, and as they tell us, the rich can achieve their aspirations and poor people cannot achieve their aspirations. So lack of aspirations and motivation is not the problem. Again, looking at here, the chronic poor have, about 70% have high aspirations. As long as it's above 50%, it's lower than the movers, but as poor people move out of poverty, it's a dynamic, iterative process. As they experience success, their aspirations go up very quickly. Let me go on to the next. So basically, we conclude this section by saying poor people actually take risks. They're not risk averse, although the kinds of risks they take are different from the kinds of risks that a wealthy person might take. Let me move on to poverty measures. I won't go into the details. We used an activity called Ladder of Life. These are community definitions. We don't define poverty. We will let local people define poverty. It's very similar to wealth ranking when the bottommost categories is defined and then the top, and then people define the steps in between. Once there's some consensus, we give them 100 to 150 households depending on the size of the community, which they rate on their status on the ladder today and 10 years ago. And then we ask them to place their poverty line on that ladder. And then the last thing is we give them the official poverty line translated into local terms and ask them to place that on the ladder. So based on this, we get the four groups: the followers, the movers, the chronic poor, and the chronic rich, or the non-poor. There are a couple of findings. Let me just, so this is, for example, a ladder from Uganda. The dark line is the poverty line. And if you look at the bottom line, bottommost category, there's just 2% that are in that category. But poor people, so the bottom two are the people who are described by negative behaviors, but the rest of the poor are not. And the other takeaway message is very large numbers of poor people are classified as poor in communities. In fact, we find that over between 60 to 70% of people are classified as poor based on these local definitions. There are two or three other striking findings. If you look at the top line here in Malawi, we need to disaggregate. One of the big messages from the report is that we've been over-obsessed with averages. And averages are good for tracking poverty, but lead to policy misdiagnosis when you're talking about poverty reduction programs. And so to inform policies and to inform program design, it's really important to look at the underlying phenomena which lead to the average figures, which is there are people, households at the same time that are moving out of poverty and those who are falling in. So if you look at Malawi, for instance, we find 38% move up and 34.8% move down. And the point being that if you look at Malawi and Andhra Pradesh, that if you just stop the falling, you're going to get large numbers of people moving out of poverty. That if a country has large percentage of people falling into poverty, while another lot is moving out of poverty, you're not going to see aggregate poverty reduction. The second point that comes out from this is that there's a lot more churning than has been thought of before, which means that poverty is not, there may be a large number of people trapped in chronic poverty, but even amongst those people, there are many people moving up and many people moving down. And so vulnerability is a key issue. and that we have to take into account this vulnerability, and that if such large numbers of people are moving up and down, then you really can't think of poverty as a permanent characteristic. But we need to look at poverty and think about how to create resilience. And I'll show you some graphs later that this has to do with investing in assets and helping poor people build assets, permanent assets, that reduces this churning. The next thing we looked at is people's own sense of confidence, their power and rights, their control over decision making. And we find that the psychological dimensions have a very important impact, both coming through very, very strongly in the qualitative data as well as in the quantitative data. That movers report more control over decisions, but these are, remember, poor people who have now achieved some success, and their belief in themselves goes up. But again, this is a diagram from the quantitative, from our regressions. I'm just reporting the numbers on personal agency. These are point estimates. These are standard errors. And so when a dot is above the line, it's a positive association, and if it's below the line, it's a negative association. And you see that there's lots of dots that are above the line and quite a bit above the line, which means that basically if you take in Bangladesh, I think it's about 12 or 18%, it increases the probability of moving out of poverty by 12%, which was higher than the assets that they owned. Now, this doesn't mean that assets are not important, but that it has implications for poverty programs and design, so that we need to do program design in a way that increases people's dignity and sense of self-worth. Economic opportunity, again, we focus at the local level, and there are 2 points to make here. One is that there's very strong locational effects. It's where you live matters tremendously, and I'll give you one example from Kagera, from the Kagera region in Tanzania. Here we were fortunate to have panel data, the kids' household survey from 1993 and 2004. So we look at the data from 1993, and based on the economic model, you can make a prediction of which household is going to should move out of poverty and which household should fall into poverty. Then we had the actual data from the household survey from 2004. And what we found is very interesting. We found that the economic models were very good at predicting falling. They were correct 78% of the times. But in terms of predicting moving, it was true only 50%, which is really not a prediction, because that's true by random, right? By chance you get that right. You throw a coin, it's heads or tails. So then what we did was we looked at the people who were the surprise movers, and we'd also collected life stories, right? We had life stories along different dimensions, and we looked at them and we said, what is it? Why is this happening? And what we found was that there were, in fact, very strong locational effects. And this is why it's important to take into account community effects. Where you live matters, which community you live in matters. And what we found that in the remote communities, initial assets, initial conditions were not so important. Were important, because your education, your assets, your access to land mattered. But for people living in communities where there were markets close by, or there was business opportunity, who you knew mattered. So the ability to hustle and make contacts with the rich mattered a lot. And again, in Kagera, it was summarized as, in a men's discussion group, they said, when a rich man falls ill, you will see a line of poor people outside their house waiting with little gifts for the rich man who's sick, hoping that they will be remembered when he recovers. But if he dies, nobody shows up, because it's over in terms of their investment. It's not a wise investment to invest in a dead man. The second thing we find is that markets are in fact rigged. And everywhere, because of poor people's poor bargaining power, they are in fact cheated in all kinds of ways. And this cheating is quite institutionalized. In Tanzania, they had a name for it called masomba. So in the coffee growing areas, they said they get cheated on weighing of coffee bags, And they called this Musomba because they said they made the coffee beans as light as sunflower seeds. So in a bag of 50 kgs, they would be cheated at least 10 kgs. So they knew they would lose out by 10 kilograms. And they summarized this in other areas saying it's the rich man who controls the prices. Being poor means never being able to set the prices for your goods, no matter what it is that you produce. So poor people actually want more free markets, but they want markets to which they have access and where they have a fair chance. In Andhra Pradesh, this power differential was two things. One, they said in terms of economic opportunities or the quality of economic opportunities were very constrained, and they said there's a ditch in front of us and a well behind us. And the other thing in terms of power differentials they explained was that a rich man is the head of the village and a poor man is the head of the burial ground. So they very deeply know power because they experience it in their daily lives. Let me show you, I think this one slide is important to look at loans. Chronic poor basically borrow for consumption. And these loans are useful, but they keep them trapped, churning in and out because don't get them to the next level where they can use this for productive opportunities and start building assets. It's also very interesting that we find higher levels of corruption where economic prosperity, economic opportunities open up, and we can come back to this during the discussion. Local democracy. 2-3 findings. I think the most important is, again, that we need to look below large national labels. We need to look below labels, which is, for example, in India, which is a liberal democracy, and Morocco is considered by political scientists an illiberal democracy. But we find many more communities with responsive local government in Morocco than we do in India. And in terms of the overall variation, we found that 93% of the variation in terms of responsive local democracy, whether local democracy is responsive, is within countries rather than across countries. So again, and we are again focused on the national level, so we need to come down to the local level and make the links up to the national level if we want to see any large-scale change. Poor people also value freedom. They don't see any reason to trade off between freedom and food. They see development as freedom and freedom as development. That's not Amartya Sen, that's a poor women's group in Uganda. And in Tanzania and Philippines, they said very similar things. And in many areas, they define freedom as the ability to protest and to stand up for their rights, but often they don't do so because of the consequences. We looked at democracy, local democracy, responsiveness. We used 4 measures and combined it into an index, which is trust, satisfaction, extent to which the government listens to you, and the extent to which you have contact with the local government. And we see very strong effects on provision of basic services. So then we asked, does it affect in moving out of poverty? And we found that at the household level, it's still a zero-sum game in most contexts. So if you think of a local government and limited resources, whether it's houses or seeds or fertilizer packs in Malawi, and these need to be distributed, that if one household gets it, if I get it, you will not get it. So we see strong positive effects sometimes on individuals or individual households, but the rest of the people suffer. So the community suffers. So it's local democracy that will gain all. We still have a ways to go. Inequality emerged everywhere. The inequality, except in the conflict context where in some areas inequality was going down, in many areas they said inequality is increasing. The most poignant definition was given in Bangladesh, where a man said inequality is carrying a sack of sugar on your head all year and never being able to taste it. Let me move to the last point, which is on collective action. Okay, this is on roads. Again, you see the big differences. corruption levels are very high and have gone up. I forgot about this. Corruption mostly has a negative association, but in some contexts, like in Indonesia and Tanzania and Assam, there's a positive, strong positive association, and people are able to bribe and collude with local politicians to get out of poverty. Collective action. We basically asked people, this is my last point and I'll close, is what do you do when you are in trouble? Who do you turn to? And the answer was mostly 85% of people turned to the family, to their own families. It wasn't NGOs, it wasn't the organized private sector, it wasn't to government, although these do emerge in different contexts and there's some variation. We also found that this propensity to collective action very often had a negative association. And some people find this very upsetting, as I did initially, but when you think more about it, it makes sense. The kind of collective action we're talking about is lots of people, a few people coming together and cope, being able to share some rice or some seeds or some money to help in everyday survival. But this is because the governments and their systems in which they live are dysfunctional. So it's a coping, it's a survival strategy, and it doesn't help them move ahead. So we basically conclude that the potential of collective action has not been fulfilled. Where these groups, as we see in Andhra Pradesh and sometimes in Bangladesh, where these groups have started networking and federating and get resources from the outside, and this process takes a while, maybe 5 to 10 years, there we do see moving out of poverty. So in conclusion, I would say that there are 2 or 3 things that are really important. One is there has implications for poverty measurement. That if you look at poverty, how poverty studies are done, they still basically look at characteristics of the poor. And the characteristics of the poor, the implicit assumption, although everyone would deny it, is that poor people are the fault, are the problem. Because we don't look at institutions that, in the local level institutions that come in the way. The second is that, is it possible, particularly if states are dysfunctional, to think about it in terms of the bottom-up state building, particularly in conflict contexts, where states have either fallen apart or have dissipated. And finally, in terms of both local democracy and local markets, if the focus is at the local level, we need to link backwards and upwards and help create both markets as well as democracies that work at the local level and that include poor people. Thank you.
Thank you.